want to make 4 quick points, if I may. The first is about the summit itself. The summit should be very much seen as a waymarker, not an endpoint. For those of you who remember the Chicago summit 2 years ago, had very positive deliverables. People came out feeling very good, and those deliverables weren't acted upon. So one of the big strategic things that the summit leaders need to be aware of and need to be focused on is the summit is a waypoint, it's not an endpoint. The second thing I want to say, and again, this is in the kind of broader strategic sense, is that there's a risk that the summit ends up being about putting out fires rather than a more strategic summit about where NATO is going. And so one of the things I will be looking at, or looking for next week, is that the summit, yes, it pays attention to current events, but actually is framed and looks much further ahead to a more strategic vision for where NATO is going. Looking a little bit more specifically on the summit, essentially there are going to be 4 broad sets of issues that the leaders will comment on and that they will focus on over the 2 days. The first is inevitably the events in Ukraine and Russia. There will be some strong statement about Russia's actions, not least Russia's continued actions or alleged actions earlier today, yesterday, in southern Ukraine, but there will be a strong statement from the NATO leadership about what Russia's doing and NATO's response to that. The second area that will inevitably be covered during the summit is on Afghanistan. As Paula said, this is the end of the year, is the end of the formal operations in Afghanistan, and the NATO leaders will be thinking about and presenting about what kind of a posture NATO will have, what kind of actions NATO will have going into next year. It is possible that the new Afghan president will be attending. Theoretically, he's supposed to be announced early next week, but we don't know that yet. The third thing that will be in the summit deliverables or in the summit declaration is there will be some statement about spending, NATO defense spending. Of course, we keep coming back to this 2% of GDP that all NATO members should be spending on defense that isn't being met except by 4 members. A couple of others of the Baltics have said they will re-up their money after Russia's recent actions. But there will be some statement about spending, whether it's back to the 2% or whether it's 20% of all defense spending should be on equipment. I don't know, but there will be some statement about more defense spending. And then the final comment, and perhaps the most substantive comment, is how is NATO going to restructure itself to become, in Rasmussen, NATO Secretary General Rasmussen's words, to become more flexible, to become faster in responding. He talks about a readiness action plan, which is about training, about posture, about capability. He talks about the NATO response force, but it's more broadly couched in this: how do we make NATO more effective for today's challenges? And that's where I want to just pick up in my last point, which is, I think, the most important part of the summit and what I will be looking for in the summit declaration and the summit commentary, which is this idea of how NATO needs to reformulate itself, restructure itself to meet the challenges that it's facing today, but also for the next decade. And essentially, and I will be very brief, much of this is in the report, the summary of which was on your chairs. Essentially, there are 5 tasks NATO needs to address. It needs to deal with reassurance and deterrence, crisis management. These 2 things have been integral parts of NATO for its existence. But it also needs to improve its intelligence and early warning. It needs to focus more on resilience, not just of the NATO member states, but the NATO neighbors and NATO partners. And perhaps, arguably, most importantly, it needs to focus also on public diplomacy. It can't make any of the changes it needs to make unless the political leadership has public support. And right now, 60% of NATO publics don't actually understand NATO, don't really know what it does. And so public diplomacy is going to be a very important part of how NATO moves forwards. Many ways of doing this. Some of them you will see in the NATO declaration, summit declaration. Some of them I suspect you won't, but this is what I'm going to be looking for. To this idea of speed and flexibility, there has to be not just faster action, which is about positioning in part, positioning forces, rotating forces, positioning equipment, and Secretary General Rasmussen talked about that yesterday. But it's also faster decision making. It takes too long to make decisions because you're looking at a 28 consensus decision-making process. So how can we make, at least on a tactical and operational level, faster decisions? I'll be looking for issues of more effective joint planning. Right now, NATO talks about joint planning. What that means is NATO member states come together to tell one another what they're doing. That's not joint planning. How does NATO get around that? Joint acquisitions, again, that's a very sensitive issue but needs to be dealt with. The third area that I'll be looking for is partnerships. NATO talks a lot about this. It will, in the summit, talk a lot about this. But it really needs to start distinguishing the types of partnerships it has, both with other other states who aren't members, but also with other institutions that bring other assets to the table. As we saw in the events in Ukraine, the response was not just a military response, but it's also an economic and a diplomatic response. These are things that NATO doesn't bring to the table, but others do. So how do they work more effectively together? That's about partnerships. And then finally, and this is where I will end, again, with this idea of public diplomacy. Both offensive public diplomacy, but also explaining NATO to the publics, to the NATO member publics.
Thank you, Paolo, as well, for putting together this opportunity today to share our thoughts a little bit in advance of the NATO summit. And as Paolo mentioned, I had the pleasure to chair a group of other kind of think tank experts to think about this issue back in June. Actually, you don't have a summary of the report. You have the report. It was meant to be 3 or 4 pages, and we stretched it, I think, to 5 or 6. But what you've got on your chairs is the full piece there, just for your reference. So very quickly, similar to Xenia, let me make 4 overarching points that we can get to your questions and points. Yes, as Xenia said, this is a way station rather than endpoint as a summit, but it is a critical summit nonetheless. And to me, it strikes me as critical for one particular reason. And if we look back even 2 years to the last summit, and we look back to the strategic concept that was prepared in Lisbon back in 2010, which talked about common defense, crisis management, cooperative security, laid out the architecture for what NATO should be about. But it was all theoretical. The world was not a dangerous place. It was not perceived to be as dangerous a place to the West as it is turned out to be and is proving to be day in, day out for the last 6 months. So I think this is a summit in which all NATO members and their partners need to step up and start to communicate to themselves and externally and to their publics, as Enya said in the end, this is a dangerous world. And there is a purpose to this alliance. It is not there as just a hangover from the Cold War, a kind of club, I don't know, just because the jobs and the committees had existed for so long. This alliance has a purpose for a more dangerous world. And so that's the first point I want to make. The second then becomes how you retool the alliance for this more dangerous world. And I think as important as capabilities will be perspective. Do we share as member states a common perspective of the nature of the threats? Russia is certainly, with its actions since the shooting down of the Malaysian jet airliner, with what's been taking place yesterday, today, it is certainly helping a coalescence of Western perspectives that were fairly divided over Russia are starting to come together into a certain perspective. But the dangerous world isn't just in Russia, it is also beyond Russia. And the question is, will NATO members be able to start to talk about the purpose of the alliance as something that is going to help them deal with what is a more dangerous world internationally? And so perspective will be critical. Then you come to interests, and I think this NATO summit could be an opportunity to start to overcome the underlying fractious divisions that were created by Iraq and Afghanistan, and which still poison much of the Western relationship, and which much of Russian propaganda has been trying to make sure it can keep juiced up. There's an opportunity to start to break that down here. And then we get to action. And Xenia went through a list of the kind of specific steps that will be undertaken. So I think the perspective and the reassertion of common interests will be as important as the action. And this is, again, not a way station. This is a way station rather than an endpoint. Third point, then, NATO ultimately, I think, if it is to capture the nature of the threat in this summit, it needs to start to talk about itself as part of a spectrum of responses, as being part of that spectrum. In other words, NATO is a part of what needs to be done by the West and its allies to be able to keep themselves secure. It cannot provide all of the answers. So the military reassurance steps that have been taken, that Xenia talked about there, the defense spending, the NATO Rapid Reaction Force, infrastructure, etc., are all incredibly important. But as we've seen, however strong defenses are, in a world of hybrid warfare, strong defense is sometimes just can be skirted by asymmetric means. And therefore, emphasis on other types of capabilities, what some people have called the Article 4.5, rather than Article 5 kind of capabilities of police cooperation, border management, cyber, etc., will be equally important as the more traditional types of military steps that can be taken. And I think the third point in this spectrum approach is that NATO needs to be able to talk, and I think it's reflected in the invitations that have been issued here, about itself fitting in where it can with the EU and with other actors that represent, whether it be human rights issues, the Council of Europe, the EU itself, where its position in energy security, in thinking about minority rights, the rule of law, all of these issues become incredibly important in making sure that you have resilient members and neighbors of NATO that will be more secure. My last point is this one about looking beyond Europe and Russia. I mean, it goes without saying that while everything is taking place in Russia, there's a lot going on in the Middle East. We can talk about it in a minute, so I won't say more than that right now. But the Middle East is as much Europe's, and in a way through NATO, America's neighbor, as it, as Eastern Europe is. Asia itself, which has been the principal focus for a rethinking of US security policy since President Obama came into power, cannot be forgotten at this time. There are risks emerging there, as we talk about in our report, which go cut to the quick of the economic security and well-being of NATO members as well as of our allies. And therefore, it'll be interesting to see to the extent to which this summit can capture some of that global perspective that I think an effective NATO needs to have in this world. And again, this is not just a place where security answers are the answer, but also the capability to think about this in a more, let's call it, hybrid or spectrum type of risks. And therefore, we may see references to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TPP, trying to think about the economic strength and resilience that this community of nations, that this transatlantic bond represents, not simply its existence as a military alliance. So let me stop there.